This is going to be the most consequential election in 30 years. Now do the math, 30 years, I'm saying since 1980, and I have some pretty personal familiarity with what happened then. 30 years ago this July, in July of 1980, I was on the floor of the Republican National Convention in Detroit when Ronald Reagan accepted the nomination of the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States. I heard him deliver his acceptance speech. I worked on that effort. I went to Washington, D.C. then as an intern in a very, very hostile environment. My dad, of course, was deeply involved with the effort to elect President Reagan. And I remember what life was like. I remember hearing people say that the country had become ungovernable. I remember Jimmy Carter's White House counsel explicitly advocating that we adopt a European-style parliamentary system because the current system of government was broken. The country just couldn't be managed. Our problems were too big and too complex. Reagan utterly rejected that notion. And within a few years, nobody was talking about the country being ungovernable anymore. Not only did he govern, he made it look easy. He relied on some tried and true principles that are as old as the nation itself, and in fact go back much further than that. I remember Reagan quoting Plutarch, who said that the real destroyer of the liberties of the people was he who spread benefits and bounties among them. Reagan loved the poor, but he understood that dependency was doing no favors to them. When I say this is going to be the most consequential election in 30 years, here's what I mean. We have a very clear decision between what type of government we're going to have, and that decision will reflect who we are as a nation and as a people. Here's the question that is presented to us. In another 30 years, will our children still be free? And that isn't hyperbole. This is a test of national character, and there are two dramatically differing worldviews. The Obama administration, with the wholehearted support of Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic majority in Congress, has abolished the myth of the moderate Democrat. There is no such thing. A so-called moderate is somebody who takes a few days longer to sell out, or who demands a bigger bribe before they go along with what the administration wants. And that certainly applies to the incumbent. You name it, the people are on our side, he's on Pelosi's side. Healthcare reform, he voted for the government takeover. Cap and trade, which my former employer, the Heritage Foundation, warns would raise your energy costs by an average of $3,000 per household per year because of the myth of anthropogenic carbon loading causing global warming. He voted for it, we're against it. The so-called stimulus, which hasn't stimulated anything but federal spending and debt, he voted for it, the people don't like it. His choice for leadership, he voted for Nancy Pelosi. That's one vote you'll never find me casting. But let's talk about the different visions of the role of government and the nature of citizenship that will be at stake in this election. The Obama administration is determined to turn us into a European-style social welfare cradle-to-grave nanny state. This isn't pejorative, this isn't name-calling, this is explicitly what they advocate. We advocate a restoration of a limited government that confines itself to the enumerated powers set forth in the written Constitution bequeathed to us by the Founding Fathers as the best guarantor of human liberty. Now, what do these two views say about who we are as a society and who we are as a people? Well, the Obama administration's view, wholeheartedly supported by the incumbent here, would say that we are dependents, that we need to be protected, that we are victims who need to be shielded from the big bad world by a benign paternalistic government. That rights are things that can be granted by the government at its discretion to favored groups, and rights can be acquired by confiscating things that other people have worked to earn. Our view is exactly the opposite, and it is rooted in the very principles of the American founding. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's what government is for. Rights aren't created by government. They're not conferred by government. They can only be recognized by government, which is why our Bill of Rights is suffused with lines like, Congress shall make no law respecting, or the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, or the rights not specifically conferred are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. A very different view of the source of our rights. They say government, we say God. They say if you're a part of the rights are contingent upon your membership in a victim class or a favored group. We say no. Rights exist simply by virtue of your birth, by virtue of being human. You are equally entitled to your life, your liberty, to pursue your own bliss, to enjoy the fruits of your labors. Now, I am a Reagan Republican by heritage as well as conviction and I think temperament. But it goes back deeper than that. I'm a Calvin Coolidge Republican. In his inaugural address, President Coolidge said, I aim to let the people of America work less for the government and more for themselves. I aim to let them keep the fruits of their own labors. That is the chief meaning of freedom. And he was absolutely right. It's not a materialistic philosophy, it's a spiritual philosophy. He understood that it's not just a financial issue, it's a moral issue, that it's about freedom. Well, I've talked about these two worldviews, what they say about the role of government and what they say about the nature of citizenship and what they imply for our society. Let's talk about some specific issues. What do these two worldviews mean? Healthcare. Well, if you adopt the Obama administration and the Pelosi-led Democratic majority in Congress's view, what has to be done to healthcare is this. We need to create a top-down, command and control, one-size-fits-all bureaucratic monstrosity, a total dinosaur in the information age. But the same sorts of skills and aptitudes we've demonstrated in, say, the Department of Homeland Security, we're now going to put in charge of your medical care. The Republican alternative is we're going to liberate consumers to choose what makes sense for them. We're going to liberate physicians to do what makes sense in the doctor-patient relationship. We're going to remove these perverse incentives that thrust people into third-party payer systems unnecessarily. A dramatically different vision. In energy policy, we've talked about the cap-and-trade bill that would so dramatically increase energy costs that would enforce a regime of artificial scarcity just to try to fit some utopian's notion of how we should live. In walkable communities, which means you can hear your neighbor's alarm clock and doorbell, using mass transit. Our vision is something very different. We want to take advantage of the great abundance of this magnificent earth to produce and transport and use these abundant sources of energy, of course in a sustainable and sensitive way. But we have the ability, we have the resources. We don't have engineering problems, we don't have resource problems, we have regulatory problems. Well, I could go on. We have a problem with unemployment right now. In this district, the total rate of unemployment is pushing 20% if you count discouraged workers, particularly in the San Joaquin County portion of the district, and we have several guests who've taken the trouble to come here from San Joaquin County today, and I thank you for that. What's the administration's response? Well, a so-called stimulus, which consists of borrowing money we don't have to spend on programs we don't need that mainly employ some bureaucrats. What's the alternative? Reagan taught us what we do to really stimulate an economy. We liberate the people to enjoy the fruits of their own labors. We remove oppressive taxation and regulation. We give sound money that means something. We don't have a fiscal authority that refuses to deal with deficits and a monetary authority that accommodates it by monetizing the debt and printing more dollars. We could go on and on and on and on. Bailouts. We had a mortgage meltdown that led to a credit crunch and a full-blown financial crisis. What was the solution of the incumbents? And by the way, let's admit here that the explosion in federal spending that so offends us had its origins under a Republican president and a Republican Congress. Now, they've accelerated dramatically under the Democratic successors, but it's the difference in degree, not in kind. And so, let me say parenthetically, I think our first job is to keep faith with the American people. We cannot talk our way out of problems we behaved our way into. And I am mindful of the fact that if Republicans recapture the majority, we'll be on a very short lease, we'll be on probation, and I want to be a voice for bringing the party back to its limited government roots. But what's the alternative? Weren't the bailouts necessary? Didn't we need to bail out the automakers, the banks, the insurance companies, the mortgage lenders? Well, you know, long ago, 40 pounds ago to be specific, I was a whitewater rafting guide and had my advanced first aid and a lot of my EMT training. And we learned that if somebody's dying, the first thing you do is stop the bleeding. Don't make it worse. Well, look at what's happening in public policy. Now, you remember how it was a couple of years ago. You couldn't turn on the radio in your car without hearing somebody barking, no job, no income, no money, on death row, no problem. We'll give you 100% mortgage down. In fact, we'll give you 110%. We'll pay you to buy a house you can't afford with, no evidence that you can ever pay for it. Well, stop and think. Would you do that with your own money? Of course not. Nobody else will ever care about your money as much as you do. People behaved that way because they were playing with other people's money. Why were they playing with other people's money? It was the direct consequence of federal policy. The federal government had an implicit guarantee on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage giants. That guarantee has now become woefully explicit and open-ended. These mortgage lenders were required by federal policy to generate first a smaller portion and then a larger portion and eventually a full 50% of their mortgages from subprime customers. Well, do the math. Subprime means below prime, an elevated risk that you won't be able to pay it back. Meanwhile, the Community Reinvestment Act requires them to aggressively seek out riskier borrowers. Oh yes, and capital rules, a subject with which I'm familiar from my work in banking. Generally, to be well capitalized, the bank needs 10% reserves. If you've got $100 of loans out there, you better have $10 in equity. Well, the federal government decided that mortgage-backed securities were so secure that they only needed a 2% reserve. So if you're a banker, you've got a strong incentive, in fact, you've got a mandate to make loans to people who can't pay back. You've also got a virtual regulatory mandate to get the stuff off your books. So you securitize. What happened was absolutely foreseeable. And yet the same fools who got us into this mess are now arguing for mammoth re-regulation and increased regulation of the industry. We have a better vision. Our vision is quit penalizing independence, integrity, industry, thrift, self-reliance, frugality, discipline, and risk aversion. Stop subsidizing and stop subsidizing their opposites. People are human. They respond to incentives. Well, I could go on and on. In every issue we confront, there is the Obama administration's way, and there is the American way. Now, once again, I don't intend that to be pejorative. It's not mere name-calling. When I say the American way, it's not just conservative, it's not just Republican, it is deeply rooted in our history and traditions as a free people. And the policies that are being foisted upon us by a Democratic majority that does not reflect the will of the people explicitly borrow from a different political vision. That's what this election is all about. Now, if anything I've said today has resonated with you, then this campaign is not just about me. This is your fight, too. And I do need your help. Everyone involved needs to sacrifice. If you can host an event, see Mallory on the way out. If you're in a position to give the legal maximum, please see my dad. If you're in a position to give anything at all, whether it's time, money, reputation, expertise, do it. But this is our fight. This is to recapture our country. This is to reclaim our heritage as Americans. Thank you so much.